A lot has changed in agriculture over the past 30 years or so. One thing that hasn't is farm policy. And no, that's not because it's just working so well.
If farm policy was working to help farmers, then we wouldn't have bridge assistance payments, we wouldn't have ECAP payments. I would argue that we've left the policy stuck in a certain place for too long.
And stuck is exactly where we are. That is Jonathan Coppess, who says that this is a big problem for a number of reasons, including this concept called agricultural exceptionalism.
There's very few sectors that have the level of kind of federal support directly going to producers in that way. We often hide a lot of that in the tax code, whereas farmers are getting direct payments. I mean, just the enormous amount of money we've been spending on farmers is an example of exceptionalism in and of itself.
So what does it take to get unstuck? Create policy that works for farmers and consumers and stop incentivizing overproduction.
If you step back from a lot of the self-interest, I'm this kind of farmer and I like this kind of payment, and say, no, wait a minute. You know, the whole reason ag is exceptional to begin with is the fundamental importance of producing food. And that's what we should be focused on.
Agriculture policy professor Jonathan Coppess on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hamrich, and if you're interested in where innovative ideas meet practical realities in food production, I think you found the right show. Today's episode explores an important area of agriculture that I really don't spend enough time talking about here on the show, which is ag policy. I wanted to bring Jonathan Coppess onto the program to ask some fundamental questions like, is ag policy working? And is the Farm Bill still relevant, which we can't ever seem to get past these days? What has changed in ag policy and what needs to change? As you're going to hear, we dive into this and a whole lot more here in today's episode. But first, some quick background. Jonathan Coppess is the Gardner Associate Professor of Agricultural Policy in the Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of 2 books on the legislative history and political development of farm policy. The titles are The Fault Lines of Farm Policy and Between Soil and Society. He's a member of the FarmDoc project and a frequent contributor to FarmDoc Daily. Jonathan previously served as the chief counsel for the Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry. And prior to his service on that committee, he served as the administrator for the Farm Service Agency at USDA and legislative assistant to Senator Ben Nelson. Jonathan grew up on his family's farm in western Ohio. I'm going to drop into the conversation where he's describing a little bit more about his background and then what ultimately led him into his current role at the University of Illinois.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up on a farm in Ohio, and then when I left for college, I was never coming back. Now, part of it is I'm the oldest of 3 brothers. And so my middle brother, from the time we were toddlers, right, he wanted to play with the tractors and I wanted to play with Legos or something. You know, it was always different. And so that was fairly well established early on that I was going to go do something else. And then I always like to joke that because all I did was argue with everybody, that's how I ended up on the path to law school. They're like, you're not going to farm. We don't want you, you can't drive a tractor well. You don't plant straight. My grandpa used to yell at me. He'd come and grab me when he was combining sometimes and go, come here, I want you to see this. It'd be where I fell asleep in a field and kind of got off it was before GPS, right? So if they had GPS, I probably could have just, flipped the switch and took a nap. But instead I would nod off and end up messing up the rows, and grandpa would give me a hard time about it. So no, my goal was off and on wanting to go to law school or wanting to get into something else. And when I look back on it now, I should have realized like my interest has always been government and policy and politics and history. And it's like, I tried business, I tried practicing law, and eventually I went to DC and just did what I wanted to do. And now I get this, the good fortune of being at a major university where I get to nerd out, right? Like my existence is a great kind of nerd situation where it's like, oh, I want to know why this happened. So you spend time researching and writing about it.
Talk about your time in DC. What gave you that realization that, that's actually where I want to be, not practicing law, not in private business? What gave you that realization, and what was your time like there?
Yeah, I mean, there were two things, right? There's like the carrot and stick, maybe. The stick was I couldn't stand commercial litigation. I was in a firm in downtown Chicago, and I went to law school in DC, so I had a bunch of friends out there and so forth. And in one of those kind of moments with a friend, with some friends, we are like, man, this is not what I want to do. I'm happy to work hard. I'm happy to put in the hours, but if it's two companies beating each other up over a contract that they're going to settle after I pulled an all-nighter, it seems not worth it. And so I had a friend who was working on the Hill, and he's like, you've always been a political dork. Why don't you look at this? And so that was kind of like the prompt. I started looking into it and started talking to people and making contacts, and then moved out there and eventually landed a job with Senator Ben Nelson from Nebraska, and was his Ag LA. I got to work on the RFS in 2007. I got to work on the Farm Bill that came out in 2008, and then ended up going down to USDA and helped implement that Farm Bill, and then came back up when Debbie Stabenow became chair of the Senate Ag Committee, and I was her chief counsel. So I helped her with what became the 2014 Farm Bill before moving out here. So I had about 8 years of just, and Tim, I'll tell you, and I tell students all the time, it was the most amazing experience. Like if I could reverse time, be a younger person, and have that opportunity to go back to DC and being a staffer, like just being in the middle of it. It was great adrenaline. It was fascinating perspectives, amazing people. And I always tell students this too. I was like, if you're paying attention to politics simply on what's on a TV or now, unfortunately, social media, you're getting a theater version of it. Like the stuff that goes on, like it is so many staff people very dedicated to what they're working on, spending an enormous amount of time like trying to work these things out. And that was a lot of fun. I mean, I loved it. Again, I pretty much aged out of it. You had to grow up sometime and had a couple young kids and all that. And so this opportunity came up at the U of I. I was like, wait, all these questions I have in my head that, like where did this policy came from? Why do we argue about that? And so I've had the chance to sort of dig into it. And that's the history. It ends up, I put together a class, and then from the class, I started to put together these materials and eventually had the dumb idea of writing a book about it. And then the even dumber idea of trying to write a second book about it. And so that's kind of the mode it's moved into. But almost all of that really surfaces as questions come up, beginning with, oh, why is this the policy we're having such a hard time negotiating? Where did that come from? And then one question leads you to another. You're in and out of rabbit holes and so forth.
This might be off topic, or it might be right on topic. I'm not sure. But, one thing I'm curious to nerd out on at some point is to try to understand the history of checkoff programs. And I've just kind of casually Google searched, and I'm not really able to come up with too much. And I'm sure you have much better methods of researching these types of things. But we have all these checkoff programs now, and they're big entities with a lot of money in some cases. And they're also a source of controversy. It's kind of like, well, what's all the history to go back to when all this started? I don't know if you've looked into that at all.
So I haven't, and I want to be careful that I don't mislead based on my lack of having dug into it. And it's actually one of those topics that I'm really fascinated about too, and I've just never had the time. It's always been like, I'll get to that some other day. But I think a lot of this, like if you look at the big sort of scope of that history, right? And that there's a lot of what we now academically, some people call it agricultural exceptionalism, or right. We have a farm credit system. We have a variety of sort of exemptions or other things. And typically what it is that the system, particularly in that like pre-modern times, like the post-World War II era, after that, everything changes a lot for farming. But when you're in a much more agricultural rural society and you've got a lot of small individual operators, like none of the other things worked well for them. And so cooperatives, for example, right? The extension system, right? The whole land grant system. Like these ideas were sort of bubble up because the existing system doesn't deal with the farm setting well. So we kind of create another version. So banks are not lending to farmers, right? Because of all the risk and so forth, and because they're banks, they have other challenges to deal with. And so we create a farm credit system in the 1914, 16 timeframe. I have to remember my years exactly. So I think that's part of it. They're evolving through policies to try to help farmers. So checkoff dollars are to promote, consumption. So dairy, right? The famous got milk. And that's really kind of where that comes from, is the idea is we're farmers are struggling with prices. They're struggling always. I mean, this is the history of all of this, right? The prices are never high enough, in part because it's a bulk-based commodity and none of us want to pay more for food, right? So it's like, how do you promote it? If promoting it improves the prices and improves farm incomes, and then farmers can do better and obviously stay in business. I think one of the challenges we really have in policy is once something is put into the system, right? Once it's fixed into the statute and all this stuff built up around it, it's really hard to change. And so one of the things I think we all find frustrating about policy, whether we sort of fully think this through or not, is this sort of lack, the sort of rut you get stuck in. Like, oh man, why do we keep doing this thing? Well, that's how we did it, 1920s, we set this operation up and it continues, it gets very entrenched and it's really hard to change it. And that's just one of the fundamental realities of policy, is that it's changing it is really difficult. And we get really stuck on, oh, well, that's how we've done it now for X years, right? And each year adds another layer of but that's how we've done it for 90 years. Well, sure. So there's a lot of that goes into it. But I don't know I don't know the full history of the checkoff system, and I would mislead you if I tried to get too deep.
No problem. I know it was kind of a random just like thought, because it's something I thought.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm telling you, it's on my to-do list someday before.
That'll be the next book, maybe. Okay.
No, I think 2 books are enough.
All right. Well, I'm really interested in this idea of agricultural exceptionalism. I don't think I'm not familiar with that term, but it makes sense. There's a lot of things you can point to that's like, okay, ag needs its own, be it farm credit or, policy, farm bill, or whatever the case may be. Is that argued in policy circles? Like, should there be an agricultural exceptionalism?
I mean, and I want to give full credit. Like, that term is not mine. That's used in different settings. So you'll see it a lot in particular, like law review articles arguing about exemptions for agriculture from like the Clean Water Act and those sort of things. And I've other friends and colleagues and people I talk with have used it in different contexts. And so it sort of bubbles up in my head of like, oh, there's more to this, right? It's not just exemptions. It is this sort of setting it up. To your question, is that argued? Yeah, a little bit. Like, if you listen to congressional debates about foreign policy, right, there is an exceptionalism framing that people put on this. And you can kind of see it play out, right? You might hear a member of Congress go from talking about how farmers are sophisticated businessmen that need, the tools to operate, and at the same time saying we've got to help them out immensely because the world's not fair, right? They're price takers on the commodity side, and they're price takers when they buy things. And so you'll see a bit of that version of it. And then the entire farm support apparatus is like a nonstop reminder of that, because there's no other business that quite has that, or there may be other businesses, but there's very few sectors that have the level of kind of federal support directly going to producers in that way. We often hide a lot of that in the tax code, whereas farmers are getting direct payments, and then you go for everything from a farm program and a farm bill to these ad hoc programs. And I mean, just the enormous amount of money we've been spending on farmers is an example of exceptionalism in and of itself. So I think you see it. Maybe they don't argue it that way because that term is part. I think it's a very academic kind of term, but you certainly see it in the arguments and in the policy.
And sometimes I feel like it's unfair being the host of a podcast, because you get to ask a really simple question that it has a very complicated answer that there's no way you could cram into an hour, but it maybe gets a conversation going in the next direction. So with that caveat,
I thought that was the whole point of doing a podcast.
It is. Yeah, exactly. I get the easy job. But let's say you're I don't know if you have kids, but let's say your kid comes to you with one of those questions that only a kid can ask. You're like, oh man, this is tough. And they just like, is farm policy working? Like, is it doing what it's supposed to do? How do you start to tackle a question like that?
Yeah, I mean, that is like a burning question. If one of my kids ask it, I don't know, I have to probably think about a different answer. But as between you and I think I would say, no, it's not, right? If farm policy was working to help farmers, then we wouldn't have bridge assistance payments, we wouldn't have ECAP payments, right? There's issues in that. I would argue that we've left the policy stuck in a certain place for too long. So this idea of base acres and fixed price triggers and issuing payments, on some of the calculations we have is actually not helping farmers, particularly younger farmers or farmers who want to innovate or adapt to changes, right? I mean, we're kind of stuck in this system. But part of the problem to that answer is, well, then what would work? And I don't know, because for 90 years, we've tried a few versions of this and we've really struggled to come up with something. And all along the way, farmers have struggled. The number of people who are in farming now has dwindled drastically. So we're not keeping people in farming. We're consolidating around land and all parts of the farm sector. So I think there's a lot of things that would say, yeah, it doesn't appear to be working. And back to my earlier point, you're sort of stuck in this entrenched space. So what is the answer? Well, the answer seems to always be throw more money at it. And I worry that that's actually hurting farmers more than it's helping. And, then we fall off a cliff and have to then have emergency responses. And that's, my near-term future of agriculture, I have a lot of concern that we're kind of stumbling towards that cliff very quickly. But I think it's hard to argue that any of it works given what we're doing.
And so it's just this never-ending cycle of needing to throw more money at the problem because we don't have a foundational policy that works.
Yeah, and it's kind of a paradox of the exceptionalism aspect too, right? So here's a good example on this is crop insurance. Crop insurance is probably the most effective farm policy we have, right? You go in and buy an insurance policy, we subsidize the cost of the farmer, and then you have a loss that triggers it. Now, the weaknesses of that some will argue is that it's year by year on prices. So if you have a multi-year price decline, it's not helping there. And then, of course, everything you do in policy has a ripple effect. So if you help on prices, then farmers may not make adjustments for the new market realities, so on and so forth. If you have an insurance policy that's overly generous, they may take risky decisions that they wouldn't otherwise make, and we may be insuring them to continue things. And so there's this constant challenge that policy doesn't operate in a vacuum. There are, sort of Newton's law, right? Every action is a reaction. So we do this, and then there's reactions and so forth. And so it's one of the reasons why we keep revisiting it. But crop insurance is a great example. It's a very effective system for the farmer, largely because it's tied to the realities of the risk they face on the farm. But it has challenges. We have a lot of concerns about how it's rated and whether, here in Illinois, we see a whole lot of a situation where farmers pay into an insurance program and do not receive indemnities, which you would expect, right? You don't expect to get an indemnity. But when we see other parts of the country that get indemnities every year, get payments every year, and far more than they're putting into the program. And so, there's questions about how well it's operated and rated and whether there's a fairness issue and an integrity issue in that, because it's insurance. So you don't want the federal support to just basically be a self kind of feeding problem, right? If you're growing a crop in an area that cannot grow that crop over time, and basically it's just getting insurance indemnities to keep trying it, to throw seeds out and see what happens kind of thing. Not that anybody does it that way, but the sort of, characterization of it, then the policy is part of the problem. Right. And that's what's really tough is that, OK, then how do we fix that? Or what changes do we make that policy that then doesn't make it more ineffective for more farmers? And so it's a challenge. Again, as a nerd, it's what makes it fun. I mean, you're constantly in a state of churn and disagreement about, oh, we should do this or we should try this. Let's analyze what this might, if we made these changes to crop insurance, how would it operate? What's our best guess? And we're always overlearning the last lesson and applying it to a future we know nothing about. I've not met anybody yet that can predict the future with any accuracy.
That is a good moniker for this show in general. That's I like that. Well, I mean, it does seem like it's possible that maybe one of the key underlying assumptions that drive farm policy is changing or perhaps has changed, which is just we just need to produce as much as we possibly can. I could see an argument on both sides of that, but I definitely could see it being worth questioning. Hold on, Are we incentivizing just overproduction? And before that wasn't really a problem, but maybe today it is. Is that what you're perceiving?
That's exactly right. And history gives us a really, I don't want to say great set of lessons, but lessons that we should be paying attention to, because every time we push overproduction, there is a collapse. And so some of the biggest examples, right, is we pushed wheat to win World War I in the 19 teens, and then we overproduced wheat and the markets collapsed in the 20s. So before there was a Great Depression, there was an agricultural depression and farmers were going out of business, and then the Great Depression makes it all worse, right? And that's the sort of origin story of how we start paying farmers directly assistance. And then you're trying all these mechanisms within it to say, we don't want the support program to encourage you to produce what the market doesn't want. And so you're constantly wrestling with that. The 1970s, again, that 73 stretch is another good example in which there's this sort of overnight exuberance about export markets, right? So Secretary Earl Butz and the Nixon administration cut a deal with the Soviet Union, and they sell a bunch of stored grain out over to them. Well, that spikes prices, and there's this exuberance. You can see it in the remarks from somebody like Secretary Butz that we've reached the promised land in American agriculture, and what we need are farmers to go fence row to feed the export market demand. And what happened? The 1980s, right? And so we've seen this sort of up and down. So your point is exactly right. It's one of the fears one of the concerns I have is anytime you see a policy pushing farmers into an overproduction state. And one of the challenges we've always recognized in policy, but have struggled to deal with, is each farmer is an individual decision maker. So for Tim, it may make a hell of a lot of sense to go fence row to fence row, maximize production and get as much in the grain bins as you can get, and then market it and deal with it. When there's 500,000 Tims doing that over 300 million acres, the whole thing runs into problems. And because of that, we've not ever sort of solved that farm dilemma, if you will, that conundrum around, we gotta, we tried this policy for decades after the Depression, where we would tell farmers, you can only plant so much of this, right? This allotment system, which failed miserably. But it was an attempt to try to address that oversupply challenge. But again, there's a lot of pressure, right? You think about an oversupply, low price scenario to the farmer is probably low prices to the consumer, or reductions in the price to the consumer. Now, in the modern system, I think we've seen a pretty significant disconnect on that, or at least more of a disconnect than usual, because there's so many players in the supply chain that are all getting money. So by the time, you think of that food dollar, I pay $1 in at the grocery store. By the time it gets to the farmer, there's about a nickel left because so many people have taken out of that. And so we don't see necessarily that direct relationship between low crop prices and low food prices. And now we're kind of seeing the exact opposite, which is low crop prices, high input costs, but high food prices. And I think there's a bigger set of questions about what's going on throughout the agricultural and food supply chains. And this, again, is where policy, I think, has complicated our review of this, because we look very narrowly. What does it look like for the cotton grower? What does it look like for the wheat grower or the corn grower? Like, wait a minute. Most of these farmers are growing multiple crops. In fact, they might be better off if they had more options of crops to grow, but you don't have an elevator to ship it to, for example. So I think what we fail to do oftentimes under this sort of veil of exceptionalism is step back and say, no, wait a minute. Are we setting them up for the next cliff problem because we won't change the policy? Or it's too hard to change the policy. And so we get stuck, and then like I said, it just sort of does that until, and again, my direct point of these recent ad hoc payments is they're tied to the acres you plant. So there is a incentive to look at, well, what do I think the next payment's going to look like? I'll plant that crop.
That, it just seems like we get more and more firmly entrenched into legacy policies. It's funny, Earl Butz is a really interesting figure to me. He comes up so often, and it's kind of like, it's almost like it's Earl Butz's world and we're still just living in it, although he's, long since gone. When was the last time we had kind of comprehensive farm policy reform?
The closest is 1996. That's the big one in our lifetime, or in relatively modern times. And here again is a great example, right? 1996 solved one major problem that we'd had for 60 years of farm policy, and that was the payments are influencing the farmer's decision to plant. And when the payment's tied to a price, the lower the price, the bigger the payment. And the price is low because the market doesn't want the crop. And you're encouraging a farmer to plant a crop that there's less of a market demand for. So the policy works in opposition to, if not damaging to. And so we'd struggle with that. So in 1996, they decouple the program payments. They create this contract base acre system, which uses a historic planted record, and that's your payment. The freedom to farm concept. And so the farmer can plant soybeans on corn base, get a corn payment, and that doesn't matter because I'll plant the crop that makes sense for me. That was the idea. Of course, it's been, 30 years now? And we haven't really changed that policy very much, yet everything else around that has changed. The RFS, the genetically engineered seeds, export market issues, China, obviously the big one with soybeans right now. And we still have these base acres. So now it's possible. And then you add what Congress did in the reconciliation bill in the summer, where we've just doubled, and in some cases more than tripled, payment rates per acre. So now it's like, I've got rice base and I can get $300 an acre, and I'll go plant soybeans on that because I can grab the soybean market, grab my $300 an acre check from the government. That's a pretty good deal for me. Meanwhile, you grow soybeans on soybean base in Iowa, and it's like, wait a minute, I'm getting $2 an acre or $10 an acre from the government and competing for that same market. So it's a good example of we solve one problem, and because we've not been able to update that in any way or reform or revise that, in an ideal sense, it's evolutionary. Every time we reconsider a farm bill, we make important changes to update it. But it's hard to do that because you have invested interest. And, if I'm a rice grower and I get $300, I surely don't want to lose that deal, right? And so it gets really tough to make those changes. And then the longer it goes, the more and more difficult it gets to change. So now we're 30 years deep on a base acre policy. It doesn't work because we got to do all these ad hoc and bridge payments, which are on planted acres. And so now we're like, the policy's almost fighting itself at the farm level.
I mean, it feels like we're stuck.
We are stuck. I mean, I think the only honest thing is we're really stuck on where we're at in the policy space, and it's hurting farmers. And I think that is, again, if you step back from a lot of the self-interest, I'm this kind of farmer and I like this kind of payment, and say, no, wait a minute. The whole reason ag is exceptional to begin with is the fundamental importance of producing food. And that's what we should be focused on. But we are, Tim. I mean, there's no doubt we're stuck in the mud here, in the policy mud.
And I mean, sometimes the rhetoric out there sounds like, if we just get a farm bill passed, almost like then we'll be unstuck. But it seems like our problems are much more, they run deeper than that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that gets us into a whole set of issues about why, where my head's been a lot in recent work is just like, what is it about the system, Congress and the committees and the congressional process? Like, what sort of allows this, or in reality seems to encourage this kind of policy behavior, right? And that's a tougher issue because solving that is like, constitutional type questions or congressional rule type questions. But a good example is the budget. We have this whole budget set of policies. So you can't pass a farm bill without abiding by all these obscure budget rules that really lock you in, right? Because we're going to project scores over 10 years, and we're going to say if you do something new and it costs money, you got to cut something else. And so now you're fighting over that. And this budget, what I would call a budget mess of a policy mess, has really impacted passing legislation in Congress, and the Farm Bill is an example. And so now, you look up and say, well, maybe that's worth it, except it's done no good for the budget because we're full of deficits and we're full of debt. So we've actually not solved the very reason for the policy. We've not solved, but instead we've allowed it to alter how we make policy changes outside the budget, and then we're stuck. And so I think that's a big part of it. For example, I'm always leery talking about budget because people look at me like, well, it's boring.
No, I mean, it's interesting to hear how it impacts something like farm policy and the Farm Bill, and it sounds like because we are stuck, that's where these like ad hoc payments to farmers start popping up.
Right, and they're off budget, right? So the irony of stuff like that $12 billion in so-called bridge of payments is not budgeted. It's just borrowed against the debt. Whereas if Congress tried to do that, they'd have to offset that cost over 10 years, like not just the one time. They'd have to offset it for 10 years. That's $120 billion offset, right? It's like, why would you do that? You're making it easier to just pretend the things you're spending money on, you're not spending money on, harder to manage the things you want to spend money on.
And this is the part that would get me very frustrated if I were in your shoes. Like, when it becomes political, it's like, okay, I can, dedicate my life to understanding the law and understanding the reasons for the law. But then somebody has a political agenda and they just do whatever the hell they want, is the way it seems to me. And I don't know. Those are my words, not yours. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like that's something that is just always the wild card in farm policy.
I just want to be clear that I warned you about getting down this path. So when we go down this direction, you're going to say, how do we end up talking about this? But this is one of the things that has been just like, I've been knocking my poor bald head against the wall over. Because to your exact point, right? How is it particularly that the smallest sort of group, right? Or what we would call a faction, a political faction, like how is it that they always win in this process? And I think one of my theories is that this budget thing makes it a lot easier, because if you're really small, and a great example in the farm bill space is the cost projections for farm payments versus the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, right? So if you're really small, we can pay $300 a base acre for rice, which is just like 4 million base acres. Corn's 94 million acres. So to pay that kind of money on corn is really expensive. At the same time, SNAP is helping 42 million people every month. So it's like $10 a day, but $10 a day to 42 million people. So this budget actually makes it easy. In the same way that we're doing off-budget stuff, it actually seemed to make it easier to get to the response you just had, which is, we all know we should change this, but why is it that some small group that's getting too much of a benefit is able to prevent it? And part of that answer, I think, is that the budget makes it easier to do that. And we've complicated sort of the voice of the larger interest, right? The general public is too challenged because the cost for 42 million people every month is enormous, even if the benefits are small. So this is where I nerd out, obviously, more than I should, but it's also where like the barriers to change become really substantial. Because now we're not just talking about tweaking a formula to make payments to farmers. Now we're talking about congressional budget processes and procedures. Now we're talking about the legislative powers under the Constitution. And that's climbing Mount Everest when you were hoping to just walk up a hill.
Based on kind of farm bill in recent years, I think it's left me wondering, and I'm sure others, like, all right, well, it's kind of a joke that we don't have a farm bill. Do we need a farm bill? Should we just let it die and start over? How do we understand what the role the farm bill plays when there's so many forces kind of working against it today?
Yeah. So now we go from, trying to sort out lessons from history to staring ahead into that unknowable future, right? And so you've done a good job of keeping me on the path here. The short answer is I don't know. My estimation, based on this sort of historical stuff we've talked about, that what they did in the reconciliation farm bill, cutting SNAP by $200 billion and doubling farm program payments by about $65 billion, is what destroys the coalition, right? There's no coming back from that. There's no point in which SNAP interests in Congress or those who support it are going to say, oh yeah, let's do that again, because, it was pretty controversial. And so I think, in my estimation, we're about to find out now what that means, right? Now we've got everything reauthorized through 2031, so it isn't like it's happening tomorrow, but these farm program payments, I think they're now going to have to justify their existence on their own, and that's going to be really tough. Now, where I try to conjure optimism, because I've been in a dark place for a little while here, but where I try to conjure optimism is, well, if we understand that we've been stuck for for this whole 50-year time frame, like we kind of got deeper and deeper into this mess, then I sort of try to get some optimism out of the idea of, well, then we've just changed that. And so with that change, it's going to force other changes. And so I do think there is some reason to have at least a modified version of optimism that says, okay, if we have to now justify paying farmers without the protections of the SNAP coalition, well, then we got to really make sure we're making good policy. And that could force the issue. Now, again, there's a lot of reasons to be very skeptical of that and be very, doubtful that, Congress is in a tough place overall. I think we just have to acknowledge that Congress is not functioning, certainly not as it was designed, and certainly not as any of us would like it to, given it plays such an important role. The writing of legislation, the writing of law, and the sort of, almost alchemy of taking the challenges of constituents and the challenges of society and working them into legislation, right? And all of a sudden you're like, oh, people are hungry, need help, and we come up with a way to try to help them. Farmers are hurting, we come up with a way to try to help. But right now, Congress is not in that place, and that's really concerning. So I don't want to be unreasonably optimistic. I do think it gives an opportunity to rethink these things now that you don't have that snap coalition, but I'm not sure certainly our current Congress has that ability. And I don't know what that looks like. So, the obvious questions that follow on from this are, I don't know, and I don't know, and I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. No, I think those are honest answers. One thing we haven't really touched on, we've touched a lot on kind of like, the kind of price income support for the farmers, but we haven't really touched on conservation programs, which I know is something that you've worked a lot on. Is it something where maybe we don't need to incentivize overproduction so much, but we do need to incentivize conservation? And is there kind of evidence that shift can be good for all involved?
So I'm just going to warn you, this is the kind of question that got me down into the rabbit hole of writing a second book. Because I came away with that same question of like, why aren't we using conservation more? Because intuitively, it makes great sense. Here's assistance to the farmer and all of society benefits. So if that assistance cuts down on soil erosion or wind erosion or water quality problems, or out west, too much water used in this is, I hate the term win-win, but this is the kind of thing, like, this is a policy that seems to be helping the narrow interest as well as society in general. And what's amazing to me when you go back over the history is how little we as a society, and Congress in particular, has done for conservation. It has always been an afterthought. It took a Dust Bowl in the 30s for them to even write something with conservation in it in 35 and 36. It took this collapse in the 80s to get the Food Security Act of 1985, which had the Conservation Reserve Program came back and the compliance provision. So I don't have a good answer. And it's actually, I tried to write a whole book to come up to try to answer that question. And I don't know what it is other than, again, there's this sort of strange paradox about the fact that, yes, it benefits farmers and it benefits society, but it's too removed from most people to really understand how it benefits them. And for the farmers, it's not their preferred way of getting assistance. And so it actually sits in a weird space. And the other thing that at least my working conclusion in that book was a big part of the problem, again, was this budget policy. Like when we got back to conservation in the 80s, we'd already really screwed up the legislative process with the budget. You think about it, like the Conservation Reserve Program has a limit on the number of acres we can enroll, 27 million. There is no such limit on crop insurance or farm program payments. The EQIP program, Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which is that direct cost share, conceptually cost share offset, it's only got $2 billion a year. It's a cap amount of money. The Conservation Security Program, $1 billion a year authorized for, right, or provided for. So they're capped, they're limited. And so what ends up happening? You got a lot of farmers who want conservation assistance, right? I think most of them want to do the right things in their fields. I think they see the benefit over time. They see the struggles and the challenges competing in the markets they do. And so we have massive backlogs. And again, this would be the case where you're like, wait, if all these farmers want this assistance, wouldn't Congress, who wants to help farmers, provide them more assistance? And we tend to almost do the opposite. We limit it, we cap it. Once it's capped, it's hard to get to, then it really frustrates the farmers. And so then their support for it dwindles even further. So, the future question I see here is there a functional way to combine the concepts of risk management, the concepts of the economic assistance for farmers with conservation so that we get a better policy setup that helps the farmer, but does so in a way that helps society with all these other challenges, and frankly also helps the farmer, right? Like farmers are better off when their soils are not eroding. They're better off when the fertilizer that they purchase from a giant company doesn't end up in the waterways. And so being able to sort of figure that out, again, in my optimistic, very thin, very dim light of optimism, it is that we may now, without a farm bill, without the sort of coalition with SNAP, we may now in farm policy spaces have to figure that question out, where we've been able to kind of avoid it. Now it becomes a question of, if you want that money, then how does that look for all the people that have to vote for it and pay for it out of their tax dollars? And so, again, I'm not gonna give you like some, cheerleader happy rah 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 thing, but there's a chance, and it does open that chance. And if we look back in 5, 10, 15 years and say, we broke that, but it allowed us to get here, then it's an interesting question. And if we are able to help farmers with the broader scope of risks, right? We narrow in on weather risk and price risk, but there's a lot of other risks farmers face. And so if we can help them with more risks and a more comprehensive understanding of what that looks like, particularly younger farmers. And I mean, I'm really worried about what's going to happen to this sort of, any farmer that's been farming for the last 20 years has had the RFS kind of keeping prices up, right? They've not gone through an 80s or late 90s. And so I'm really worried about that, particularly as these payments just pile into the farmers with much more established systems. And then you hear a lot of frustration. They don't have they want to adapt. Many farmers want to make changes, and our policies are not helping them. They're likely even presenting barriers to making changes and innovating. So, you'd love to see a policy scenario where you focus on the future of farming, the future generations of farming, and you focus on those innovators and the ability to adapt and adjust to the changes without kind of boxing them in.
I can see where it's really, really tricky to write policy that puts those incentives in just the right spot. Well, you've already told me that there probably won't be a third book, at least not in the works right now. But what are kind of the burning questions you have that it probably won't lead to a book, but you're really focused on right now and diving deeper into?
Yeah, I just finished writing a law review article that sorts through this sort of death of the farm bill idea, like what happened, and then kind of sets that up. So looking forward, I'm still kind of trying to sort that out. Like, how did we get to this point, and are there things that we can sort of barriers that we can either lower or break down that allow us to get that change? When it comes specifically to policy, I am, the two functioning brain cells I have left are fighting each other over, okay, what would the conservation risk management policy look like? And so we've been doing some really interesting work on that. And I'm hoping that, the better brains that I work with can sort of help, come up with the modeling around some of these ideas, and we can look at it. One of the things, so a good example of this, or a specific example of this, is something around like with cover crops. And so, cover crop is a great practice for the farmer, for the field, the soil, the water, so forth. But it comes with an enormous amount of risk. And in particular, so we've really focused in on that spring planting window. And you can imagine this, and Dad would talk about this too when he was cover cropping, like, the neighbor got in fast, but I got to now deal with, a few thousand pounds of cereal rye biomass in that field, and I got to adjust my planter, and it may be wetter, it may be drier, it may be harder to get through. And so there's a whole host of things. And if the weather doesn't cooperate, which, is most days or most seasons, you're going to have a weather problem, and you've got, just a limited amount of time that spring, that's a big risk. And so we've been trying to work through some ideas and modeling up that kind of like how many days are typically available. How does a cover crop, for example, change that aspect? And so I'm hopeful that we can work on those kind of questions, and again, I'm a kid in a candy store. We have brilliant scientists all around here, and I'm the dummy that gets asked questions like, whoa, what about this? And, then we have these modeling capabilities and the deep soil scientists and the crop scientists. And so I'm hopeful, again, that we have this kind of opportunity now that maybe we start listening, or Congress or interest groups or others start to say, okay, we do need to fix this. And these are some of the challenges we have. I think climate change, is going to make it even worse. If it's altering some of the weather patterns that farmers are used to, that risk changes. So if it's a wetter spring, typically, now cover crops look a lot different. Or if it, so I do think there's just a lot of these questions that, in the best sense of applied science, that we can work with scientists and science and try to, run scenarios for policy. And it'd be great, right? Like, next time the Ag Committee starts looking at this, we can say, here's some ideas, and here's what we think this would do. And then we could try to inform that conversation and let people figure it out as they go. But again, I'm also a realist in how difficult those things are going to be. A lot of what I'm working on now is trying to think forward of, what are the lessons from history, what are the lessons from policy and politics and political development, and how do we integrate that with science and really come up with, some of them may be crazy, some of them may be bad ideas, but you kind of need some bad ideas to bounce around to maybe knock loose a good idea or two.
Well, yet another potential moniker for this show right here. You need some bad ideas to knock loose some good ideas. I really love that. Thank you so much, Jonathan Coppess, for being on the show today. Really, really enjoyed that conversation. For somebody like me, who I'm not an expert in ag policy, it was really great to get that context and sort of that primer on the background behind where we are today and what led us into this situation. I'd love to do more episodes on where we go from here, and so maybe we'll have to get Jonathan back on the show and get his recommendations for other perspectives as well to talk about where do we go and how do we get out of this stuck situation. Also, leave a link in the show notes for his books, The Fault Lines of Farm Policy and Between Soil and Society, as well as his research page at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Thank you again to Jonathan for being on the show. Last but never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I really don't take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.